Hello and welcome back. My name is Katie and today I wanted to share with you my top 10 favourite Australian fiction books. Now, I am a 30-year-old white woman who only really started intentionally reading Australian books about 4 years ago. So I don't know like the entire lay of the land as far as Australian books are concerned. I'm not some authority, but I have read quite a few and a lot of them I've absolutely adored. And I love BookTube, and I especially love watching people explore titles from outside of America or outside of the country that they live in. And I don't hear enough of you talking about Australian books, so I wanted to share some that I would highly recommend. I have tried to put these vaguely in order from my 10th favourite to my absolute favourite, but as with all rankings, it's imperfect and it changes depending on my mood, but that's enough of a caveat. Let's get started. The first book I'd like to talk to you about is The Coconut Children by Vivian Pham. This book is so captivating. It is essentially a story set in the 90s or the 80s from memory, in a small town, and we really explore the relationships between several Vietnamese immigrant families. The book starts out pretty intense with a little bit of an insight into the actual journey that one family member made to Australia, fleeing Vietnam and coming to Australia via boat as a refugee, which I think is an important way to start the book because it certainly frames the rest of the experiences that sort of happen among family members, and primarily we follow the daughter of the refugee that we first meet at the very beginning of the book. Why I'm recommending this book is because I think it's a really beautiful and interesting read, but also I think in particular it captures like the teen angst and the bigness of teen feelings really, really well. Vivian Pham, I think, was 16 or 17 when she wrote this book, which is just incredible to me. Some of her like language and turns of phrases are just like absolutely beautiful, and they felt really unique. The characters feel so alive. If you appreciate a character that jumps off the page and you feel like you could touch, that you could get to know yourself, this is absolutely a book for you. There is a lot of heavier content in here as well. As I said, things like racism, intergenerational trauma, as well as an exploration of the role of like drugs and drug trafficking and all of that sort of stuff, and how that influences this community as well. At the heart of it though, there is also just like beautiful moments between characters. There's a really sweet romance that develops. Like this book really is about the people that make up this community. It was quite a punchy read. I got through it very quickly, but it also had a pretty strong emotional impact too, and left me just kind of in awe of Vivian Pham, to be honest, and I can't wait to see what else she does in the future. Next up is Bila, Yarrudhanggalangdhuray by Anite Heiss. Anite Heiss is a very successful author here in Australia. This is the first book of hers that I have ever read though. It was just published this year, so it's a pretty fresh one. This is set in the towns of Gundagai and Wagga Wagga in the 1850s. So it is an historical fiction, and in it we follow Waggadine, who is possibly my favourite character that I've read this year. She is a young Aboriginal woman who is a servant to a white family, as was the case for many Aboriginal people of this time, sort of forced servitude. We didn't call it slavery, but you know, she didn't have any choice in the situation and wasn't compensated. It starts out with the flood of Gundagai, which sort of destroys the town. And it is a true event, and this part of the book is absolutely based on true events and true people. I don't want to sort of spoil what happens throughout the story, but the themes that are explored are done so well, but it's still such an accessible read. This was an absolute page turner. I think more than almost any of the other books, this was the one that I could not put down. What I especially loved was the exploration of the relationship Waggadine had with the white wife of the family that she was serving. Her name was Louisa, and she is a Quaker and very much considers herself a good white person. She considers herself an ally of the Aboriginal people. But there's also a lot of like white saviorism sort of coming through in her character. But it's done in such a way that I think Anite Heiss was very generous in her sort of exploration of the character of Louisa. She allowed her a lot of nuance and complexity, even though she was continuing and enforcing the oppression of Waggadine, and she wasn't all that self-aware of her role in that system. I don't know, that relationship was just a really interesting one to watch develop. But it is the character of Waggadine herself that is just, like, it is the beating alive heart of this book. She is just such an incredible main character, and like the romance that develops later on through the book is just absolutely beautiful to watch, and I think is what sort of makes this book a lot more like accessible and like enjoyable to read than some of the other books I'm going to talk about later. The only criticism I had of this book at the time was that I do feel like the ending is a bit rushed, so just be prepared for that. However, I will say that even though I was sort of frustrated by that at the time when I read it, now, like with the space of a few months, I like barely remember that frustration, because the overall experience of this book and like the things that it left me with to think about and to contemplate were just so good and rich. And overall, this book was so enjoyable, even though it tackled some really challenging topics. I have nothing but good things to say about this book at this point. Next is a book I read like 2 years ago or so I don't really remember all the details, but I absolutely loved it when I read it, and that was There Was Still Love by Favel Parrett. This is a much shorter book, and it is also a bit of a historical fiction. It's set in the 1980s, and we sort of switch between 2 points of view. There's one sister who's living in Melbourne with her now, like her descendants now, so like her children and their children, and then Prague on the other side of the world, the other sister living with her descendants. And so it's a story about these two different families and these two very different experiences, and what connects them is these two matriarchs who are twin sisters but who were separated at the beginning of or during World War II. And it's just this beautiful, painful, touching exploration of these two families and just how different their experiences are. One who sort of lived through the war and now lives behind the Iron Curtain, and the other who sort of escaped it in many ways and now lives in Melbourne. And the story is sort of them trying to connect, even though their lives have been so different. And it's just really well told. It's such a short read. I read this really quickly. I sobbed. It's really impactful. It's beautiful. Next is The Enlightenment of the Greengage Tree by Shokoofeh Azar. I recently did a vlog where I read this book as part of the Wild Book Box that I subscribe to. So if you'd like to see my sort of like full thoughts and experience of reading that book, I will leave a link to that in the cards in the description box below. I think this is the only book on this list that is actually translated. It was originally written in Farsi. The translator themselves has decided to remain anonymous due to safety concerns. And it is this absolutely beautiful, rich, magical realism literary novel set in the period just before and then during and sort of the consequences of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And the story focuses primarily on this family of 5, I think from memory. There's the mother and the father, and then 3 children, 2 sisters and a brother. I think essentially this is a ghost story. There is so many different sort of like magical realism elements, like there's like fairies and mermaids and stuff, but ghosts are like the thing that sort of travels throughout this story. And they're used in such an interesting way, and in a way that just, I don't know, made like the loss and trauma, and not only loss of life, but also loss of potential, feel so tangible. I do think that this represents a very particular sort of interpretation and like viewpoint on the Islamic Revolution. I know that I saw on Goodreads some people sort of felt like Shokoofeh Azar sort of presented quite a strong bias, but I think that is true to her own lived experience and the lived experience of her family. I think she's captured that very well. This family is definitely one that is not in favour of the Islamic Revolution. They're fairly well off, well educated before the revolution, and so their lives afterwards are impacted in a very specific way. The magical realism elements here are very strong, and the characters, particularly I think Beta and Baha, the sisters, are just absolutely incredible. The way that each of the characters really represents a different experience of the revolution, I think is just really beautiful storytelling. And the magical realism that is employed, I feel like just elevates this, not only in like a way that feels like culturally authentic, but also just in terms of the impact. I think it's such an emotional read and an absolutely beautiful one. And from what I've heard, the blurb on the American publication sort of spoils something that happens maybe a third or halfway in. And like, it's not spoilers because it's not how it ends, but I would just recommend not reading the blurb, because that sort of twist, if you like, or that sort of revelation was one of my favourite parts of the book, one of the most emotionally impactful parts of the book for me. Next up is about the only book that I have seen talked about regularly on Larger Booktube, and it is Nevermore, The Trials of Morrigan Crow by Jessica Townsend. This is a middle grade, and if you liked Harry Potter, but, you know, want to find something not written by a transphobe, then this might be it. We now have 3 books out in the Morrigan Crow series. I know there's definitely one more coming. I'm not sure how long this series is going to go on for, but this book is just an absolute magical delight. You can tell that it's definitely inspired by Harry Potter. It starts out with a similar sort of premise of like a 10 or 11-year-old who's sort of like shunned by her family, being whisked off in the middle of the night to a magical realm. Like, it starts off very, very Harry Potter, but I promise it stands on its own 2 feet. Once you get like past that initial very similar setup, the world of Nevermore is just absolutely delightful. It feels like Alice in Wonderland meets Doctor Who meets a bit of Ghibli. I don't know. It's so magical and alive and playful. I mean, there's a giant talking cat. They fly around on umbrellas. There's a secret society. There's a quirky magical mentor. There's a moody hotel that they all live in. Delightful is just the perfect word for this book, and I don't need to labour the point. If you like middle grade, if you like Harry Potter, if you like anything like that at all, you will love this. It's wonderful. Now I think the first truly contemporary novel on this list, it's Friends in Dark Shapes by Kavita Bedford. This is a debut novel that was released this year, and it's one of my favourite books of the year. I love this. It's presented in a series of vignettes over the period of a year after the main character has lost her father. She is like in her late 20s living in a share house in Redfern, and so it's very millennial. It explores a lot of things that I think are very relevant to millennials, especially in Australia, of like home ownership and found family. It also has really interesting discussions about gentrification, especially as this is set in Redfern, but there is a beautiful love and appreciation for the city of Sydney that this character sort of explores herself, but then also sort of interweaves with her own grief process. The love her father had for the city as well, and how her grief is so attached to different locations. And it's just a beautiful exploration of grief, I think. And what I really, really loved too is, I loved so many things, but I also really loved the relationship that is sort of told in retrospect that the main character had with her father. It was a complex but ultimately a very beautiful one, and I think that's something that I just don't see a lot in fiction, especially in millennial, like contemporary fiction. There's a lot of stories about like mothers and daughters and fathers and sons, but like this exploration of the father-daughter relationship was just really touching. On top of that, there is also a bit of exploration about racism and immigrant identity. The main character is second generation, and so parts of that and her identity are also explored as well. So there's just like a lot going on, but it never feels bloated. It's just about a young woman sort of figuring herself out, figuring her life out in the wake of her father's passing, in the middle of a city that doesn't always feel like as like communal as maybe she wants it to. It's really easy to get through. It's not that long, but then on top of that being vignettes, like each little snapshot is like so digestible. And I ultimately just adored her writing as well. I think this doesn't read like a debut. It's not clunky or anything like that. It's very confident. And also I just felt like Kavita's authorial voice was really well established. I don't know, I just felt like I was in safe hands, and I devoured this. I absolutely adored it. The biggest book on this list, and I think what will be the hardest sell, but also possibly one of the best books I've ever read. I just finished it last night and it's kind of prompted me to make this video. It is Carpentaria by Alexis Wright. This is the oldest book on this list, I think. It was published in 2006. It won the 2007 Miles Franklin Award, which is like the really big prestigious literary award here in Australia. And it's chunky. It's 520 pages, but prepared to spend twice as long as you normally would on that amount of pages reading this one. At least that was my experience. It is dense, it is heavy. It has this very dreamlike, almost foggy quality because it is non-linear in its storytelling and just very unconventional, which just requires more work from the reader. But I promise you, it pays off. There is a plot sort of going on, but it doesn't feel too central because, as I said, it's very non-linear. This feels less like a novel and more like written down oral mythology. It feels like an epic. It's set in modern times. It's set in a small fictional town of Desperance up in the northwest coast of Queensland in the Gulf of Carpentaria. And we meet a lot of different characters in this book. There are a number of white characters who live in the town of Desperance, like the police officer and the mayor, for example. But then we also meet, and who are really our central driving force in the book, several Aboriginal people too, who live on the outskirts of the town. Many of these Aboriginal people are living in quite dire situations of poverty and are influenced, and you can see the sort of projection and experience of intergenerational trauma playing out in their relationships too. There's tension between two different Aboriginal groups in the area, and then on top of that, of course, there is a lot of racial tension between the white people and the Aboriginal people in the surrounds. There's also a mine which has been established in the area, which is bringing jobs and economic progress to the area apparently, but is also obviously hugely detrimental to the environment, and also there's questions around issues around native title and land rights. All of that stuff is going on, but ultimately I think this book is so much more about the characters. These characters, they were described on the blurb as larger than life, and I would go further and say that they feel almost like gods walking on earth. They feel, even though they're so real and so in the here and now, they sort of exist beyond time. They feel eternal. There's a lot of what people might describe as magical realism here. There's an animism that is present in especially how Norm, one of the main characters, sort of describes his interpretation and experience of the land. But that's present for most of the characters. The landscape is as much a character here as Norm or Will or Angel. It is not easy to read, in part because the chapters are so long, the sentences are so long, it feels quite dense. But also it's dark in terms of its subjects. There's a lot of violence, abuse, there's abuse of a disabled person, there's hate crimes that we witness on page. None of this is pleasant, and very few of the characters, I don't know if any of them are likable either. The characters in here, although sometimes they might say something funny or they have moments of tenderness, a lot of them are quite hard and harsh, and I think that's a result of their situation and the intergenerational trauma as well. It's not a pleasant read in any sense, and yet it tackles so brilliantly so many different themes and issues, and it does so in such a nuanced way that I feel like you could sit and talk to someone about this book for hours and still have more to pick apart. And on top of that, this is some of the most beautiful writing I have ever read. It's wholly unconventional, and I think you just sort of have to be patient and let the book unfold as and when it does for you. You sort of have to meet the book where it is. But at least for me, that effort was more than worth it. It was a journey and a half, and I feel like it changed me. I don't know that I've ever read a book that was so much work and so uncomfortable and yet so impactful and so beautiful and devastating. It's so many things, and I can't I feel like this is the book everybody says that they want to read at some point, or people who are interested in Australian literary fiction anyway. This is the book that people want to read one day but don't get around to. I was there with you, and I totally get that, but don't put it off. It's unlike anything I've ever read or experienced before. It's just incredible, an absolute gem, and I could not recommend it more highly. Then another winner of the Miles Franklin is The Yield by Tara June Winch. This is a little more recent though. This book is absolutely incredible. It's been so well celebrated here in the last couple of years, and I still don't think it has as much hype as it deserves. This story has sort of three threads running through it. The main one, which is the one that sort of drives the plot, is set in present day, and it's told from the perspective of the granddaughter of this family that we're going to be following. She's an Aboriginal woman, been living in the UK for quite a few years, but she comes home back to central New South Wales when her grandfather passes away. And her story is very much about her reconnecting to her family, sort of understanding their situation, as well as discovering that her grandmother will be sort of kicked off the land that she's been living on for her entire life because she doesn't own it. And through that we get an exploration of native title and land rights. We also have a pastor writing a letter in the, was it late 1800s or early 1900s, who ran a mission in the area. And so we get that history of stolen generations, dispossession, of genocide, assimilation through him. And then the other part of this book, which I think is brilliant and that elevates this story to next level, is the dictionary that the grandfather has written down. He is basically trying to preserve his language because he knows he's going to die. And so he's creating a dictionary. But rather than just sort of like writing out the meanings of words in like the traditional dictionary sense, he's creating a story through the meanings of each word. He's telling the story of his life in order to keep his language alive. And it's beautiful. So I think if I had to pick one book that I would implore you to read that I think you'd be likely to read, it would be this one. I think for so many reasons. I think it is pretty accessible, much more so than Carpentaria anyway. And I think it's doing so much to honour and document the history of Australia and the realities that continue to be present and influential, but in a very contemporary way. And I think a lot of books have sort of tried to do the like preserving or celebrating language, but none has done it so explicitly and so well as The Yield. Tara June Winch also just has a very distinct voice, and I think like this took her many years to write. You can tell that it's a labour of love. She put everything into this, and the results are just incredible. And as great as all those books are, I think my favourite Australian fiction is still Foreign Soil by Maxine Beneba Clarke. This is a collection of short stories, and it's one of my favourite books of all time. It's been quite a few years since I read this, and I'm at the point where I want to reread this book, but it's a collection of short stories that essentially centre people who either feel that they do not belong to an area or to a community, or they are perceived as not belonging by other people around them. So they are considered either internally by themselves or externally by others as foreign. And it's an exploration of what this means, how this impacts people, how people sort of like live through that experience, how people make meaning and connection to land and to community, and what happens when those things are severed by force or dispossession, or by the need to seek refuge, whatever it is. A number of these are set in Australia. There's one set in Footscray, which is right by where I live, which was the reason I initially picked this up. There's also some set like featuring refugees in like Villawood, for example, but there's also stories from around the world and people in very different situations and circumstances with very different experiences. Maxine is quite a prolific author in a lot of ways. She's written for the Saturday paper. I think she still is writing poetry for the Saturday paper. She's published a poetry collection. She's written, which I read recently, a children's book. I think it's called What We Mean When We Say Black Lives Matter. She also wrote for the Saturday paper a series of portraits, which are collected into a book that I've also read. Maxine's just one of my favorite authors, but primarily like this is, I don't know, I think this is just brilliant, and it's one of my favorite things that I've ever read. Like I said, it's been a long time since I've read it, so the specifics are a bit fuzzy, but like the really strong emotions that this book brought out in me, like both the good and the bad, like the absolute joy and celebration and beauty of identity and experience and community, but then also like the harrowing sense of loss and grief, of isolation, of dispossession. Like, I just think this, like, there's a lot of range here, and it's just beautifully done. Maxine, I think, does have a very strong voice, and although I did have favourites in here, I don't remember really feeling like this was a mixed bag, as I often do with anthologies or collections. I feel like every single story was really strong, really solid. I don't know, I just think the way that Maxine manages to make short stories so compelling and to get you invested so much so quickly, it's really effective. Hi, Katie from the future. I just realised that I only included 9 books in this video. The whole point was that it's the top 10. And I realised why that was. It was because I was agonising over which book would make it to the 10th spot and I couldn't decide. So then I sort of just forgot about actually making that decision. So I thought I would just quickly tell you about like my honourable mentions, which were vying for the 10th place, and if any of them intrigue you, you can look into them. The first is The White Girl by Toni Birch. This is a book about the stolen generation. It's set in the 1970s, and I really in particular loved the way that Toni Birch sort of captured the relationship between the granddaughter and the grandmother in this book. I thought it was beautiful. Then A Room Called Earth by Madeleine Ryan. I don't think that this would have made the top 10 in terms of like my own personal preference. I really like this book. I gave it 4 stars, but I wouldn't call it a favourite. The reason I was sort of contemplating putting it on this list though is because I think it might appeal to a lot of people who are on BookTube. Partly because this cover's incredible and of course it would look amazing on your Instagram, but also because it is very sort of like young adult contemporary vibes. The author as well as the main character are neurodiverse, and this book covers the period of just one night and then the next morning of the main character going to a party. She's a bit judgmental, but also it's just really fun and funny, and just a really interesting read. I had a lot of fun reading it. Then The Lucky Galah by Tracy Sorensen. This was the book that sort of started me off on my reading more Australian intentionally journey. This is set in 1969 in a small town in Australia, and it's sort of a community that participates in the running of the dish, which helped with the moon landing. And it's just an interesting look at like community and relationships in this small town in Australia at this time. But what I especially loved about it is that it's narrated, it's told from the perspective of a pet Galah. And then a book that I've read very recently, I read it just a couple of weeks ago, is 100 Days by Alice Pung, and it is a fairly new release. This is a very claustrophobic, atmospheric read about a young 16-year-old girl who falls pregnant. Her mother is Chinese Filipino, I think from memory, I've just spaced, and her father is a white Australian. And so it does definitely deal with like her relationship with her mother and her father and how both of those are not really ideal. They're complex in their own way, but it focuses mainly on the relationship she has with her mother, which is a very sort of like overbearing, high expectation, one that sort of devolves into a kind of abuse, I suppose, where the mother becomes so controlling of Karuna, the main character. I don't know, it's not a pleasant read, it's uncomfortable, but it's really well done, it's beautifully written. I think in terms of my own personal enjoyment of the book, which one I felt more connected to, I think that would be The White Girl by Tony Birch, but the other three, I think I could make an argument for why any of them would sort of round out the list quite well. So instead of 10, you got 13. You're welcome. There are a number of other books that like could have made this list and maybe on another day would, but for now, these are the top 10 Australian fiction books that I would recommend to you. Reading books published in Australia is not like my sole focus. I also like value reading a lot of other stuff too, but it is something that I try to incorporate into my reading on like a regular basis. So if there's any Australian books that you feel like I haven't gotten to yet and that I would love, or that you definitely recommend for me to read, I would love to hear those in the comments below. But for now, that's all I really have to share with you. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you pick up any of these books based on my recommendation. I would love to hear how you go with the book. And until next time, so much love. Bye.